Silence has a way of exposing truths that noise often hides. It does not announce itself with raised voices or dramatic confrontations. Instead, it settles into moments that feel ordinary until they are not, until something small feels wrong and cannot be unseen. In my family, silence was never considered dangerous. It was treated as maturity, as respect, as the ability to avoid conflict. I grew up believing that if no one was arguing, everything must be fine. That belief stayed with me until the night silence stopped feeling peaceful and began to feel intentional. After my parents passed away, our family became quieter in ways that felt subtle at first. Conversations shortened, explanations softened, decisions were made somewhere else and delivered to me as finished conclusions. I was told not to worry, not to ask too many questions, and not to stress over details that were already handled. Silence became a shield that protected others from accountability, while convincing me that trust meant stepping back. I did not realize at the time that silence was not protecting me at all. It was training me to accept not knowing. What made the betrayal so painful was not a single moment of cruelty, but the absence of honesty stretched over time. Important conversations never happened. Clear explanations were replaced with vague reassurance. I was never openly excluded. I was simply not included. That distinction mattered because it made everything easier to deny. No one told me I had no right to know. They just behaved as if my understanding was unnecessary. Silence became the tool that allowed control to grow without resistance. As time passed, I began to notice how silence appeared whenever questions got too close to something real. A pause would stretch longer than it should. Eye contact would break. Answers would arrive late or not at all. Silence followed me through hallways, sat across from me at tables, and lingered after conversations ended. It felt heavy, not because of what was said, but because of what never was. Each quiet moment carried the same unspoken message. This is not yours to question. The betrayal revealed itself not through confession, but through discovery. There was no warning, no explanation, no apology waiting on the other side. Silence stood where truth should have been. It was in the empty space left by missing answers, missing transparency, and missing respect. When I finally saw proof of what had been done, the silence surrounding it felt louder than any argument could have. It told me this was not a mistake. It was a choice that had been protected by quiet cooperation. What hurt most was realizing that the people involved relied on silence as a strategy. They believed that as long as nothing was spoken aloud, nothing could be challenged. Silence created plausible deniability. It allowed wrong actions to exist without names and responsibility to dissolve into confusion. By the time I understood what was happening, the silence had already done its work, reshaping relationships and shifting power without ever raising suspicion. The moment betrayal became undeniable, silence changed its meaning again. It was no longer something being used against me. It became something I chose. I stopped explaining myself. I stopped asking for understanding from people who had already shown me their priorities. Silence became a boundary rather than a weapon. It gave me space to see clearly, to act carefully, and to protect what remained of my life. This experience taught me that betrayal does not always arrive with confrontation or cruelty. Sometimes it comes wrapped in calm voices, polite smiles, and unanswered questions. Silence can feel safe until it is used to erase your voice, your rights, and your place. When that happens, the quiet becomes revealing rather than comforting. It shows you exactly where you stand, who is willing to speak for you, and who benefits from you staying quiet. In the end, silence revealed a family betrayal not because it hid the truth, but because it made the truth unavoidable. When there was nothing left to say and no explanations left to offer, the quiet exposed everything that words had carefully avoided. Trust can be a fragile thing, built over years through consistent words, shared experiences, and the quiet understanding that those closest to us have our best interests at heart. It is rarely tested in dramatic, explosive ways. More often, it erodes in subtle increments, almost imperceptibly, until the foundation beneath it is gone. In my family, trust was something I assumed would be constant, something guaranteed by blood, history, and shared care. I believed that as long as I followed the rules, respected boundaries, and accepted guidance from those older and seemingly wiser, my future would be secure. I learned too late that trust can be quietly taken, siphoned away not in one sweeping act, but in a series of deliberate, almost invisible maneuvers that leave the person being betrayed unaware until it is already too late. From the moment my parents passed, the landscape of responsibility shifted without conversation. Roles that might have been clarified through open discussion were instead quietly claimed. I was told not to worry about details, that certain things were already handled, that paperwork, finances, and decisions were better left in the hands of someone more experienced. Those words, repeated in calm tones, reassured me while simultaneously removing me from awareness. The very act of being kept in the dark, presented as kindness or protection, became a method of control. I did not see it as manipulation. I saw it as guidance. That slow erosion of trust began with omission information withheld, meetings I was not invited to, documents I was not allowed to review. Each small exclusion seemed minor, insignificant even, yet the cumulative effect was profound. Over time, it became impossible to distinguish between care and control, between protection and possession. Control in our family did not arrive with confrontation or overt displays of power. It arrived quietly, like water seeping into cracks in a foundation. Decisions were made in private. Access to accounts, records, and legal authority was slowly redirected. Requests for explanations were met with delayed responses or vague assurances, reinforcing the idea that my involvement was unnecessary. Each time I inquired, my voice was politely deflected, my curiosity framed as concern rather than necessity. Gradually, I became conditioned to accept silence as instruction, to wait rather than act, to trust rather than question. It was a clever, insidious method of control because it never appeared forceful, never triggered resistance, and never invited scrutiny. By the time I realized the extent of what had shifted, the ground beneath my own authority had already been quietly dismantled. The erosion of trust was reinforced by small patterns that, in isolation, seemed harmless, transfers of funds that went unexplained, accounts that I was told were managed for my benefit, and decisions that were quietly finalized without my knowledge created a rhythm I did not notice until I tried to break it. When I attempted to reclaim clarity, I faced barriers that felt procedural rather than malicious forms that were delayed, access that required additional steps, explanations that were confusing or incomplete. All the while, those controlling the flow of information maintained a calm exterior, presenting themselves as organized, responsible, and concerned. It was a careful performance of trustworthiness that masked deliberate exclusion. The true impact of this quiet betrayal became evident the moment I realized that control had been fully shifted without confrontation or resistance. I could see how trust had been taken in a way that did not feel violent, did not feel aggressive, and did not provoke immediate anger. Instead, it left a strange, heavy clarity that comes when the pieces finally align. The things you assumed was safe were never under your control. The decisions made in your name were shaped by someone else, and the confidence you placed in family had been leveraged against you. The realization was sobering because it revealed not just deception, but the patience and calculation behind it. Trust, once quietly taken, can be more dangerous than trust that is openly broken, because it leaves the mind convinced of its own safety until the damage is irreversible. In the end, losing control in silence was a lesson in observation, patience, and vigilance. It forced me to recognize that trust is not just about faith in others. It is also about accountability, transparency, and clarity. When trust is manipulated quietly, control slips away without immediate notice, leaving only the weight of hindsight to measure the full scope of what was taken. Learning to reclaim agency required more than anger or confrontation. It required careful tracking, deliberate actions, and the courage to step back and restructure life according to the reality I discovered. That slow, quiet loss of trust became the foundation for understanding how vigilance, clarity, and boundaries are essential not only for protecting assets, but for preserving the self. Power is rarely obvious when it is exercised quietly. It does not always arrive in the form of loud commands or visible dominance. Often, it comes wrapped in gestures of care, in assurances that everything is being handled, in the calm voice of someone who convinces you that they know better. In my family, power was held in this subtle, almost invisible way, and it was my sister who commanded it. From early on, she positioned herself as the one who understood structure, who could navigate the complexities of finances, legal documents, and decisions that affected all of us. I was guided to trust her, to defer to her judgment, and to accept her management as a natural part of life. At the time, I saw her as responsible, as the older sibling who had our family's best interests at heart. I did not realize that what looked like care was also a careful accumulation of authority and control. The way she operated was methodical, almost invisible. She did not have to demand obedience. She created an environment where obedience became habitual. Documents were presented as delicate, explanations were vague, and decisions were framed as too complex for me to understand. Each interaction subtly reinforced her role and diminished mine, not through conflict but through omission. I was not formally excluded, and I was never told I had no rights. Instead, she quietly assumed them. Over time, I came to accept her guidance as wisdom, never recognizing that the control she wielded was deliberate, maintained through silence, and protected by the trust I placed in her. Her power was reinforced by secrecy. The more she controlled, the more information remained private. Account details, administrative access, financial records, all were managed without my oversight. I was told to focus on my life, my studies, my routine, while she handled the important matters. The secrecy was never framed as deception. It was framed as protection, as responsibility. It was easy to believe that she was safeguarding our family's stability, especially since she presented every action with calm authority and quiet confidence. Each time I asked questions, I was met with carefully measured answers designed to redirect or soften. The secrets she kept were hidden not behind aggression, but behind politeness and control over access. Her authority extended beyond paper and numbers. It shaped relationships, influenced behavior, and created patterns in which others, including me, complied without realizing it. I stopped asking too many questions. I stopped expecting transparency. I deferred to her on matters I should have had access to, reinforcing her position further. Control and secrecy intertwined so seamlessly that it became difficult to see where one ended and the other began. She did not need to make threats or raise her voice because the structure she built did the work silently. When I finally began to notice inconsistencies, her calm authority became a mask rather than protection. I saw evidence of actions taken in my name without my knowledge, financial decisions that benefited others at my expense, and a pattern of secrecy that had long been normalized. What had once felt like guidance was revealed to be deliberate management of outcomes that excluded me. The realization was disorienting because it showed how much power she had quietly accumulated and how carefully she had hidden the truth behind the facade of care. The sister who held the power and the secrets was no longer just a sibling. She had become the central figure controlling access, shaping reality, and deciding whose voice mattered. That control was not maintained through confrontation or force, but through consistency, patience, and the ability to make silence feel safe while quietly holding authority. Recognizing this shifted my understanding of family, loyalty, and trust. It became clear that power exercised quietly, reinforced by secrecy, can be more effective and more dangerous than any overt display of control. By the time I confronted the truth, I understood that her authority was not accidental. It was intentional, protected by trust and secrecy alike. It had been built slowly, invisibly, and it was held with careful precision. The challenge was no longer to reclaim what she had taken, but to understand the structure she had created and to dismantle it. Step by step, without losing myself in the process. That lesson about the intersection of power and secrecy would shape the way I approached not only my family, but every relationship that demanded clarity. Boundaries and awareness. Following the money can be a strange and sobering journey. It begins with small curiosities, questions that seem minor, almost inconsequential, and gradually grows into a path you cannot ignore. In my situation, it started with noticing subtle patterns that did not make sense. Accounts that were supposed to remain stable showed small discrepancies. Transfers that seemed routine began to repeat in predictable ways that, when observed carefully, suggested intention rather than accident. At first, I hesitated to connect the dots, telling myself that I must be misreading the situation, that financial systems can be complicated and errors happen. But intuition, reinforced by repeated anomalies, compelled me to look closer. Following the money became the only way to uncover a truth that had been carefully hidden from me for years. The process was quiet and meticulous. I started by examining what I could access, reviewing digital trails, transaction histories, and records that were legally available to me. Each entry, each timestamp, each approval signature told a story that was more organized than random, more deliberate than careless. The missing funds had not disappeared into chaos. They had been moved in a way that was consistent, structured, and designed to appear ordinary. Following the money revealed a pattern that was invisible to anyone not paying attention, but glaringly obvious to someone who knew what to look for. The further I traced the funds, the clearer it became that the transactions were tied not to errors or system glitches, but to choices made deliberately by those I had once trusted. What made the discovery so shocking was not just the theft itself, but the level of planning involved. Every transfer, every entry, every adjustment was calculated to avoid detection while maintaining the appearance of normalcy. I could see how my sister had used her administrative access to control outcomes, shifting money quietly into accounts that were not in my name, into a system that relied on my ignorance for its success. The evidence was not hidden in dramatic ways. It was clean, organized, and polite-looking, designed to make anyone who glanced at it believe that everything was routine. Following the money revealed that trust, which I had assumed was mutual, had been weaponized. Alongside the financial trail, the investigation revealed behavioral truths, conversations, delays in responses, and carefully worded explanations all aligned with the movement of funds. The patterns were deliberate and consistent. When questions arose, answers were softened or delayed. When access was requested, doors closed quietly. By following the money, I was not only discovering missing funds, but also uncovering the larger system of control and exclusion that had been built around me. It became clear that the financial irregularities were just one part of a much larger structure that dictated how information, decisions, and authority were distributed in my family. The clarity that came from tracing these transactions was sobering. It removed ambiguity and replaced it with facts, forcing me to confront the reality that the people I had trusted were operating in a way that served themselves and excluded me. The evidence left little room for denial. It was not emotional speculation or circumstantial suspicion. It was a methodical pattern that mapped intention. Each movement of money became a statement, each omission a confirmation of what had been quietly happening for years. Following the money was transformative because it forced me to reclaim agency. Before, I had been positioned as an observer, excluded from decisions that were legally mine. By uncovering the truth, I could act strategically rather than react emotionally. The journey was painstaking, requiring focus, patience, and attention to detail, but it allowed me to regain control over my life and to build a case for legal action that could not be ignored. In the end, following the money did more than reveal financial deception. It exposed a betrayal, clarified relationships, and provided a path toward justice. It taught me that truth is often hidden in plain sight, and that careful observation, combined with persistence, can turn silence and secrecy into clarity and accountability. Family loyalty is often assumed to be absolute, a bond that protects, nurtures, and preserves trust across generations. We are told to believe in unconditionally, to forgive errors, to respect hierarchy, and to trust the intentions of those closest to us. I grew up with that belief deeply ingrained. I believed that shared blood automatically aligned with shared values, that family would always act in ways that preserved integrity, and that loyalty meant supporting one another through every circumstance. What I discovered, painfully and gradually, was that loyalty can be manipulated, exploited, and weaponized. When trust is quietly broken, the consequences are not always emotional alone, they can be formal, illegal, and permanent. It began subtly, with discrepancies I had initially been too trusting to question. Small transfers, unexplained actions, and decisions made without my consent seemed insignificant at first. The assumption was that they were part of the normal management of family affairs, something beyond my understanding. My sister had been entrusted with authority and had presented herself as responsible, capable, and protective. I trusted her, just as I had been taught to trust family. That trust became the very thing that allowed misuse to take root without immediate detection. It was only when I began to trace financial activity, following the money in a deliberate and structured way, that the quiet betrayal revealed itself in full. The realization was staggering. Patterns emerged that could not be dismissed as mistakes or misunderstandings. Funds that had been allocated to me were being moved elsewhere, transferred into accounts that benefited others without explanation or consent. Each transaction carried intention. Each movement reflected calculated choices, and each omission confirmed a systematic exclusion. Loyalty, in the sense I had always understood it, had been replaced with manipulation. The quiet trust I had placed in someone I loved had been leveraged against me, creating consequences that reached far beyond family dynamics into the formal structures of law and finance. When the evidence became clear, the transition from personal betrayal to legal action was inevitable. The patterns of misuse were undeniable, and informal confrontation could no longer address the reality of what had occurred. Legal consequences are precise and impartial. They do not rely on emotion, persuasion, or hierarchy. They are structured systems designed to protect rights, assign responsibility, and enforce accountability. For the first time, loyalty within my family had to be measured not by affection or expectation, but by law. Actions that had been justified silently for years was suddenly subject to scrutiny. Deadlines and formal procedures. What had been private manipulation became public record in a measured, controlled process. The process itself was sobering. Civil filings, investigations, and structured reviews replaced informal conversations and family appeals. Each step required careful documentation, clear evidence, and attention to procedural detail. Legal consequences do not care about relationships, excuses, or explanations rooted in tradition or trust. They respond only to fact. What had once been hidden behind politeness, calm authority, and unchallenged access now had to be confronted with proof, timelines, and traceable actions. The quiet manipulation that had gone unnoticed for so long became subject to formal evaluation, with outcomes that were definitive and binding. What this experience taught me was profound. Family loyalty, while emotionally significant, is not a substitute for accountability. Trust can be exploited, and even the most patient or careful silence cannot protect against intentional misuse. Legal consequences exist not to punish sentiment, but to restore balance, enforce rights, and prevent further harm. When the betrayal occurred in spaces previously governed by assumed loyalty, the law became the only impartial arbiter capable of ensuring fairness. By the end of the process, the dynamics had shifted irreversibly. Authority that had once been quietly held was removed. Responsibility was clarified. Control over my own assets, decisions, and future was restored. Loyalty had been tested, broken, and transformed into legal action that could no longer be ignored. The lesson was clear. Trust and loyalty are fragile. And when they are violated, formal consequences are not just possible, they may be necessary to reclaim stability, fairness, and personal sovereignty. In the quiet aftermath, what remained was clarity, boundaries, and the recognition that justice, though deliberate and measured, can succeed where unexamined loyalty fails. Choosing boundaries is one of the most difficult decisions a person can make, especially when those boundaries intersect with family, love, and long-held expectations. For years, I had lived in a world shaped by the rules, habits, and quiet control of others. My sister had assumed authority over decisions that were legally mine, managing finances, documents, and access in ways I did not understand at the time. I had been conditioned to accept her guidance, to defer to her experience, and to trust her judgment without question. Silence and omission became the tools through which my involvement was gradually removed. And over time, what began as care turned into exclusion. Learning that trust had been manipulated was painful, but realizing that my life could no longer be governed by someone else's version of stability forced me to confront a choice. I could continue to exist under the shadow of others' control, or I could reclaim my autonomy, even if it meant stepping away from the family I had trusted. Independence did not arrive suddenly. It came slowly, deliberately, as I gathered evidence, verified facts, and structured my actions to reclaim what had been taken. I could not rely on confrontation alone. Instead, I had to assert authority through clarity, knowledge, and strategic decisions. Legal processes became tools of empowerment rather than instruments of revenge. By pursuing formal action, I was able to ensure that the control my sister had exercised quietly over years was ended decisively and permanently. It was not an emotional response. It was a rational and deliberate assertion of my rights. Independence began to take shape in these precise steps: reclaiming access, verifying records, and ensuring that no one could manipulate my life without consent. Setting boundaries became equally critical. I learned that independence without boundaries leaves one vulnerable to repeated patterns of control. I stopped attending gatherings where manipulation could occur, reduced communication to only necessary interactions, and carefully defined the spaces in which others could influence my life. Silence, which had once been a tool used against me, became a shield I wielded deliberately. Boundaries were not created to punish or alienate. They were established to protect my autonomy, mental clarity, and future stability. Each limit I set reinforced the reality that my life could no longer be dictated by those who had previously exercised power without accountability. Life without them, the family members who had once shaped every decision and expectation, was initially disorienting. There was grief. A quiet mourning for the relationship I had once assumed was unbreakable, and for the innocence I had lost in trusting uncritically. But in that absence, clarity emerged, the freedom to make decisions, to understand consequences firsthand, and to structure life around my own priorities became empowering. It was not a life of isolation, but a life of self-possession, where choices were mine, responsibilities were transparent, and the future could be built deliberately rather than inherited through quiet manipulation. Choosing boundaries and independence also redefined how I viewed loyalty, trust, and family. I learned that loyalty does not require blind compliance, and that trust is only meaningful when paired with accountability. Family does not guarantee fairness, and love does not justify the surrender of one's voice or rights. By stepping away from those who misused authority, I discovered that self-respect, agency, and clarity were forms of care just as essential as any connection defined by blood. Ultimately, choosing boundaries, independence, and a life without those who had manipulated me became a profound exercise in reclaiming identity. It was not an act of defiance, but of survival and clarity. Every step I took: legal action, deliberate distancing, and the creation of personal boundaries, was a step toward constructing a life rooted in agency rather than obligation. In the quiet that followed, I found stability, freedom, and the rare certainty that my future would be shaped by my choices alone. It became clear that independence and boundaries are not just strategies for self-preservation. They are the foundations of a life that is honest, secure, and wholly one's own.